Excellent. Let's begin. This is the story of Oakwood Creek, a small town nestled among the old forests of Maine, where winter is long and bitter like the breath of death, and summer passes by like a terrifying dream. Oakwood Creek was nothing special, just old, faded wooden houses, a church with a simple spire reaching up towards the gray sky, a post office that doubled as a general store where people exchanged small talk and meaningful glances. Life here flowed slowly, peacefully to the point of boredom, but that was just the surface. Beneath that calm exterior was an undercurrent of secrets, fears, and a dark past that no one wanted to mention. Ethan moved to Oakwood Creek after his parents died in a horrific accident that the police could never fully explain. His distant great-uncle, a grumpy old man living reclusively on the edge of town, was Ethan's only remaining relative. He lived in an old house that smelled of dampness and cigarettes, with the curtains always drawn as if he feared the daylight. From the first day Ethan set foot here, Ethan felt a chill that wasn't just from the weather. The air in town was heavy, as if something invisible was pressing down on Ethan's chest. The people here, though they tried to be friendly, their eyes always averted when Ethan asked about the town's history or old stories. They whispered unintelligible things as Ethan walked by, and Ethan began to realize that he was an outsider, a stranger in a closed-off community. Strange things began happening just a few weeks after Ethan settled into his uncle's house. At first, they were just small, unexplainable occurrences. Footsteps in the attic when no one was up there, doors opening and slamming shut on their own in the middle of the night, personal belongings disappearing and reappearing in odd places. Ethan's uncle just brushed it off, saying the house was old or that Ethan was imagining things, but Ethan knew that wasn't it. Fear began to gnaw at Ethan. Ethan couldn't sleep peacefully. Every night, Ethan felt like someone was standing in the dark corner of Ethan's room watching him. A cold breath would brush against the back of Ethan's neck, making the hairs stand on end. Gradually, these phenomena were no longer limited to Ethan's uncle's house. They spread throughout the town. Mrs. Lacey, the kind old woman who sold apple pies at the farmer's market, said she saw the shadow of a woman in a white dress, standing under the old oak tree behind her house at midnight. The figure didn't speak, just stood still, her eyes empty, staring straight into her bedroom window. Mr. Miller, the police chief who also looked after the cemetery, found graves strangely disturbed, but with no signs of digging or theft. The earth was just thrown around as if someone was trying to claw their way out from beneath. News about Oakwood Creek began appearing on local news channels. At first, they were just short snippets about unexplained phenomena. But as the number of incidents increased and became more terrifying, even major networks like CNN and Fox News started paying attention. They sent reporters, but the people of Oakwood Creek did not welcome them. They avoided the cameras, insisting that nothing unusual was happening, just mass hysteria caused by their isolated lives. However, on paranormal blogs and online forums, Oakwood Creek became a hot topic. Theories were thrown around, ranging from ancient curses, negative energy portals, to the activity of vengeful spirits. Ethan started doing his own research. Ethan spent hours in the small-town library sifting through dusty, mildewed old newspapers. Ethan read about the history of Oakwood Creek. The town was founded in the late 18th century by European immigrants seeking a new life. Early life was difficult, facing harsh nature and less than friendly native tribes. But there was a period in the town's history where the records became strangely vague. Around the late 1800s, there was a gap in the chronicles, no records of major events, no list of mayors or important happenings, only a few cryptic notes about a difficult time and irreparable losses. While searching, Ethan stumbled upon an old article from a neighboring town's newspaper, published in 1892. The article spoke of the Oakwood Creek tragedy. According to the article, on a cold winter night, a large fire broke out at a shanty town on the edge of town, home to lumber workers and their families, mostly poor immigrants. The fire spread quickly, burning the entire shanty town to the ground. Dozens of people were said to have died in the blaze, including women and children. What was strange was that the article only briefly mentioned the cause of the fire, blaming it on a tragic accident. No full investigation was recorded and no one was charged. Ethan took a copy of that article home and asked his uncle about it. He turned pale when he saw it. He said it was an old story, not worth digging up. He mumbled something about angry spirits and they don't want to be disturbed. His uncle's attitude made Ethan even more curious. Ethan knew something horrific had happened that fateful night, something far beyond a simple fire. The ghosts began appearing more clearly. They were no longer just shadows or sounds. They appeared in human form, blurry and translucent, with empty or red-rimmed eyes filled with rage. Ethan saw them on the streets at dusk, gliding soundlessly. Ethan saw them standing in the cemetery beside unmarked graves. One evening, as Ethan was walking home, Ethan saw the shadow of a tall man standing under the street lamp. When Ethan got closer, he turned to look at Ethan. His face was contorted by pain and anger, his eyes like two deep black holes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, only a dry rasp, like the wind whistling through dry branches. The sheer terror froze Ethan to the spot, unable to move. Only when he slowly faded into the air did Ethan regain the ability to move and ran home frantically. Life in Oakwood Creek became a nightmare. No one felt safe in their own homes anymore. The residents started becoming paranoid and suspicious of each other. They locked their doors and windows tightly, installed extra locks and alarm systems, but those measures were useless against the uninvited guests from the other side. One night, a piercing scream tore through the quiet night. The next morning, the Harper family, Ethan's friendly neighbors, were found dead in their house. There were no signs of forced entry, no injuries on their bodies. Their faces were simply frozen in abject terror. The medical examiner found no cause of death, calling it acute heart failure due to fright. After that incident, many families started leaving. They abandoned their homes, their possessions, fleeing this haunted town. But some couldn't leave. They seemed to be stuck by an invisible thread. Ethan's uncle was one of them. He said he couldn't leave, as if something was holding him back. Ethan felt the same way. Although terrified, a part of Ethan was also drawn to these mysteries. Ethan felt he needed to find the truth, to know who these spirits were and why they were trapped here, consumed by hatred. Ethan sought out the oldest person in town, Mrs. Agnes. She lived alone in a small house on the hill, surrounded by a garden full of herbs and medicinal plants. She was the only person Ethan knew who didn't seem afraid of what was happening. When Ethan told her about what he had seen and experienced, she listened silently, her old eyes looking into the distance. Mrs. Agnes didn't speak plainly, but she told Ethan old stories about Oakwood Creek, stories she heard from her grandmother, and her grandmother heard from those who came before. She spoke of the curse of the betrayed spirits. According to Mrs. Agnes, the fire in 1892 was no accident. The shantytown was home to immigrant workers brought in to harvest timber from the surrounding forests. They were promised a better life, fair wages. But their employers, the wealthy and powerful men of the town, had deceived them. They exploited their labor, paid them meager wages, and kept them in terrible living conditions. When these workers realized they had been tricked and demanded their rights, their employers decided to eliminate them. On that fateful night, they deliberately set fire to the shantytown, trapping the workers and their families inside. They wanted to erase the existence of these people, burying their crime under the ashes. But those employers were wrong. The wrongful deaths and the intense hatred had turned the spirits of the victims into vengeful ghosts. At first, they only lingered around the site where the shantytown once stood, but over time their negative energy spread, enveloping the entire town. They didn't just want justice, they wanted those who had committed the crime and their descendants to pay the price. Mrs. Agnes said that the people of Oakwood Creek knew about this. Their ancestors had passed down the story from generation to generation, but they chose to remain silent, trying to forget the terrible past. Their silence, according to Mrs. Agnes, was complicity, and that was why the spirits could never rest. They weren't just seeking revenge on those who directly caused their deaths, but also on those who chose to look the other way, who allowed the crime to be forgotten. Mrs. Agnes's story made all the pieces in Ethan's head fit together. The avoidance of the townspeople, his uncle's strange attitude, the increasingly terrifying supernatural phenomena. It all tied back to the 1892 tragedy. These ghosts weren't just wandering spirits, they were victims demanding justice. The more Ethan learned, the deeper Ethan felt himself being pulled into the darkness. Ethan's dreams became vivid and terrifying. Ethan saw himself standing in a sea of fire, hearing the screams and cries. Ethan saw faces distorted by pain and fear, eyes pleading for help. When Ethan woke up, the feeling of horror lingered, as if Ethan had actually experienced those things. One evening, as Ethan was wandering around the area where the old shantytown was said to be, Ethan felt a wave of bone-chilling cold wash over him, even though it was the middle of summer. Whispers echoed in the air, coming from nowhere in particular, like the wind rustling through burnt branches, carrying sorrow and hatred. Ethan saw blurry figures gliding between the trees, sometimes stopping and staring at him with empty eyes. They didn't attack Ethan, but their presence was enough to make Ethan tremble with fear. The horrific incidents continued in town. An old farmer was found hanged in his barn, with a crumpled old piece of paper tucked into his pocket. On the paper was written only one line: "They never forgive." A few days later, the pastor's car flipped over on a deserted road, although there were no signs of a collision. The car doors were locked from the inside, and the pastor was found dead, his face frozen in extreme terror, his eyes wide open as if seeing something horrific just before he died. Despair enveloped Oakwood Creek. No one knew what to do. The police were helpless against supernatural forces. Prayers in the church seemed to have no effect. The town was isolated, abandoned by the outside world, leaving only the residents who were slowly succumbing to fear and madness. Ethan started researching further into the legends and mysterious news. On paranormal blogs and forums, Ethan read stories about spirits trapped by sudden and tragic deaths, especially the spirits of those who were brutally murdered. The negative energy accumulated from their pain, fear, and hatred could create powerful supernatural entities capable of influencing the physical world and human minds. Some articles spoke of these spirits being bound to the place where they died or where their remains were buried, and only able to find peace when justice was served or when the source of that negative energy was neutralized. Ethan also read about cases reported on major media outlets like CNN or NBC regarding haunted houses, inexplicable phenomena in locations with a history of violence or tragedy. Although news reports often tried to provide scientific explanations, sometimes they had to admit the existence of things beyond normal understanding. These stories, when juxtaposed with the history of Oakwood Creek, further solidified Ethan's belief that what was happening was real and incredibly dangerous. Ethan realized that the spirits in Oakwood Creek were not simply haunting the place. They were actively seeking revenge. They did not distinguish between those who directly committed the crime and their descendants, or even innocent people living in town. To them, everyone in Oakwood Creek was part of the system that had betrayed and destroyed them. The feeling of being watched became constant for Ethan. Whenever Ethan went outside, Ethan felt invisible eyes following him. Sometimes Ethan heard whispers by his ear, unintelligible words like flowing water or rustling dry leaves, but Ethan knew they weren't natural sounds. They were the voices of the spirits, curses and threats. Ethan's uncle declined rapidly. He spoke less. His face was gaunt and his eyes full of fear. One night he called Ethan over and gave Ethan an old wooden box. Inside were a faded journal and a few old photographs. The journal belonged to Ethan's uncle's great-grandfather, one of the residents of Oakwood Creek in the late 19th century. The entries were disjointed, full of cryptic words and hurried notes of fear, but from those trembling lines, Ethan could piece together a part of the truth. Ethan's uncle's great-grandfather knew about the plan to burn the shanty town. He didn't participate directly, but he chose to remain silent. He had watched the fire erupt from afar, heard the screams, but had turned his back and gone home. The guilt and fear haunted him until the end of his life. One of the photos in the box sent a chill down Ethan's spine. It was a picture of a group of men standing in front of a wooden house. Their faces were stern, and some of them were holding guns. Ethan's uncle pointed to one of them, saying that was his great-grandfather. Then he pointed to the others, his voice trembling. They were the wealthiest and most influential men in town at that time. They were the ones who carried out the act. And the others in the photo, according to Ethan's uncle, were the ancestors of the family still living in Oakwood Creek today. Ethan understood the blood connection. The spirits weren't just haunting the place they died. They were also following the descendants of those who had harmed them. They wanted the people who carried the blood of their enemies to pay for the sins of their ancestors. That's why the families with deep roots in the town were the most affected. The ghosts became bolder. They no longer hid in the shadows. They began appearing in broad daylight, walking the streets, standing in front of the houses of those they targeted. Their faces were filled with malice and a thirst for revenge. They didn't speak, just stared with hateful eyes, and the air around them was bone-chillingly cold. The fear reached its peak. All activity in town ceased. Shops were closed. Children no longer played outdoors. People locked themselves in their homes, awaiting an inevitable end. Despair hung heavy in the air. There was no hope. How could humans fight against tormented spirits, entities that couldn't be touched, couldn't be harmed? Ethan tried to find out if there was any way to break this curse. Ethan read about exorcism rituals, about appeasing angry spirits. Some legends said that justice had to be served, the crime had to be exposed, and the guilty or their descendants had to atone. Others said that prayers for the souls were needed to help them find peace. But how could justice be served when the perpetrators had been dead for so long? How could one atone on behalf of deceased people they never knew? And how could one appease dozens of spirits burned alive, filled with hatred for over a century? Ethan shared what he had learned with Mrs. Agnes. She listened and nodded. She said that justice was necessary, but it didn't have to be physical punishment. Sometimes acknowledging the truth and expressing remorse could soothe the pain. She suggested that perhaps the town needed to confront its past, publicly admit the crime that had occurred, and commemorate the victims. The idea was simple, yet difficult to implement in a town where everyone was trying to bury the truth. Who would stand up and do it? Who would dare face the wrath of the spirits and the opposition of those who still wanted to keep the secret? As Ethan was thinking about it, another horrific event occurred. Ethan's uncle, he was found dead in his bedroom. Like the Harper family and the pastor, there were no signs of violence, just a face frozen in terror. Beside his bed was his great-grandfather's journal, open to the last page. The final lines were scribbled, shaky, talking about "they are coming and can't escape." Ethan's uncle, who carried the blood of an accomplice, had not escaped the spirit's revenge. His death was a chilling wake-up call for Ethan. Ethan also carried the blood of those who lived here at that time. Although Ethan had no connection to the massacre, to the spirits, Ethan might be part of the bigger picture. After his uncle's death, Ethan's fear turned into a cold determination. Ethan couldn't run away. Ethan had to do something. Ethan didn't want to end up like his uncle, dying in absolute terror. Ethan decided that he would follow Mrs. Agnes's suggestion. Ethan would try to force Oakwood Creek to face its past. Ethan started talking to others in town, those whom Ethan believed might listen. Ethan showed them the copy of the old newspaper article, his uncle's great-grandfather's journal, and told them what Mrs. Agnes had said. At first, most people reacted with fear and denial. They didn't want to believe in ghost stories. They wanted a rational explanation for what was happening. But as the strange occurrences continued and became more terrifying, as others continued to die mysteriously, their denial slowly faded, replaced by despair and a fragile hope that what Ethan was saying might be true, and that there might be a way to end it all. A few people started listening to Ethan, especially the younger ones, who were not tied down by the past and didn't have many secrets to hide. Together, they researched further, digging up old records, talking to other elders, those who dared to speak. They found more evidence of the shantytown's existence, of the number of victims potentially being much larger than what the old newspaper article mentioned, and of the systematic cover-up by the town's powerful figures at the time. Pressure began to mount on the wealthy and influential families in town, those who carried the surnames of the men mentioned in Ethan's uncle's great-grandfather's journal. They were angry and afraid. They threatened Ethan and those who followed, demanding that they stop, but it was too late. The story of the 1892 tragedy and the vengeful spirits had spread throughout the town like wildfire. They decided to hold a public meeting. They invited all the people of Oakwood Creek to the church. It was a cold night, the air heavy and still. The church was packed with people, their faces etched with worry and fear. Ethan stood on the pulpit, Ethan's voice echoing in the silent space. Ethan told them about the 1892 tragedy, about the immigrant workers and their families who were deceived, exploited, and ultimately burned alive. Ethan told them about the cover-up by the perpetrators and the silence of those who knew the truth. Ethan spoke of the angry spirits demanding justice, and how that was why Oakwood Creek was cursed. As Ethan spoke, Ethan felt a wave of cold energy fill the church. The lights flickered strangely. Outside the windows, Ethan caught glimpses of blurry figures moving past. The whispers returned, this time clearer, like sounds of pained moans and angry growls. A few people in the church started screaming and pointing towards the windows. Children cried out in terror. Ethan tried to remain calm. Ethan continued speaking, his voice trembling but filled with determination. Ethan said that for the spirits to rest, they needed to acknowledge the truth. They needed to commemorate the victims. They needed to express remorse for their ancestors' silence and the injustice they had suffered. As Ethan said those words, the phenomena in the church intensified. A chandelier crashed to the floor with a loud bang. The pews shook as if something was pushing from underneath. A ghost appeared right in the aisle, its form blurry but distinct, its eyes red with anger, staring at the crowd. Screams and panic erupted throughout the church. People scrambled to get out. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan saw Mrs. Agnes still sitting calmly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the ghost. She nodded slightly as if communicating with it. Then she turned to look at Ethan, her face strangely serene. She gestured for Ethan to continue. Ethan knew what he had to do. Ethan needed to speak directly to the spirits. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control the rising fear. Ethan raised his voice to be heard above the noise of the fleeing crowd. "We know you are here!" Ethan shouted. "We know what happened to you. We know the injustice you suffered. We are sorry. We are sorry for our silence. We are sorry for what our ancestors did." As Ethan spoke those words, Ethan felt the energy in the church shift. The coldness lessened slightly. The whispers grew fainter. The ghost in the aisle was still there, but its eyes no longer seemed red with rage, replaced by a deep sadness. "We will not forget you anymore," Ethan continued. "We will tell your story. We will build a memorial to honor you. We will ensure that the truth about Oakwood Creek will never be buried again." When Ethan finished, a faint white light appeared around the ghost. Its form became clearer for a moment, and Ethan Thoang saw the young face of a woman filled with tears, but also with a hint of release. Then the ghost slowly faded into the air, leaving nothing behind but the lingering cold sensation. The strange phenomena in the church stopped. The lights returned to normal. Silence fell, broken only by the muffled sobs and gasps of those who remained. Those who had fled cautiously began to return, peering inside. That evening was a turning point for Oakwood Creek. The truth had been exposed, albeit in a horrifying and unbelievable way. The residents had witnessed the existence of supernatural forces firsthand, had heard the story from Ethan's own mouth, and felt the presence of the spirits. They could no longer deny it. In the following weeks, Oakwood Creek began to change. Under Ethan's leadership and a small group of supporters, they started implementing what Ethan had promised. They held a memorial service for the victims of the 1892 fire. They erected a small stone monument at the site of the old shantytown, engraving the names, if known, or the number of people who died there. They opened the town library, allowing everyone to view the old documents related to the incident. Not everything was easy. There was still opposition from some families, those who feared that stirring up the past would only bring more trouble. But most of the people in Oakwood Creek felt a sense of relief when the burden of the secret that had weighed them down for so long was lifted. They felt a little peace in facing the truth. The supernatural phenomena didn't cease immediately, but they decreased in frequency and intensity. The ghosts were still there, occasionally appearing, but the anger in their eyes seemed to have subsided. Instead, there was a lingering sadness. Perhaps the fact that Oakwood Creek had finally acknowledged their existence and the injustice they had suffered had brought them some measure of peace. Ethan still lives in Oakwood Creek. The town is no longer the falsely peaceful place it once was. It is a place marked by the scars of the past, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead is very thin. The stories of the vengeful spirits are still told, no longer as fearful whispers, but as a part of the town's history, a reminder of the danger of silence and the necessity of justice. Every time Ethan passes by the memorial stone at the old shantytown site, Ethan stops for a moment. Ethan feels a familiar coldness, but it is no longer accompanied by intense fear. Ethan knows that the spirits are still there, like eternal watchmen, ensuring that Oakwood Creek will never forget what happened. Their story is a warning.